Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining us for what promises to be an excellent day of discussions on the ethos and profession of intelligence. This is the first of its kind conference for CIA, which we are very excited about. And speaking of first, we had our first tweet last Friday, which we're also very excited about. Who knows, one of these days we may get our first positive press story, which will really excite us. Now, on behalf of all of us at CIA, we are indeed very fortunate to have this tremendous concentration of talent at Georgetown University, just down the river from our own campus. And I want to thank President DeGioia and everyone at Georgetown University for hosting us today, with special thanks to Professor Bruce Hoffman, Director of the Security Studies Program at the Edmund S. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Bruce worked very hard along with CIA's Office of Public Affairs planning this event. I am grateful to everyone at Georgetown and at CIA who put this conference together. I also deeply appreciate the generosity of the George T. Colaris Intelligence Studies Fund in sponsoring today's proceedings. And it is indeed an honor to have George's son, Thomas, with us today in the audience. Thank you, Thomas, for being here. Finally, I want to express my personal appreciation to the distinguished panelists who will be participating in the discussions. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your wisdom and insights. We have a terrific lineup for you today. Our four panels will be covering topics of profound importance to the intelligence profession. We will start off with intelligence and technology, followed by a discussion of intelligence and the private sector. Our third panel will address the role of intelligence in the 21st century, and we'll close with perhaps the most difficult issue of all, striking a balance between secrecy and openness in today's society. So thank you all again for being here. And I know our agency will benefit greatly from the discussions, and I hope that all of you will too. I look forward to returning this afternoon to deliver some remarks and to take your questions. But now it is my great pleasure and distinct honor to introduce a remarkable public servant as well as a great friend to provide the opening remarks. As you all know, Bob Mueller served as FBI Director for 12 years before retiring in 2013. Throughout his tenure, Bob was a transformative leader, an outstanding partner to CIA, and a source of wise counsel to leaders across the intelligence community. Through it all, he set the highest standards of integrity and lived up to them every day. It was a great pleasure for me to be able to work with Bob in the earliest years of his tenure. And also I had the honor to work with Bob in his last 5 years as FBI Director. And at all times, Bob embodied what it means to be a true professional, a selfless patriot, who works tirelessly every day to keep this country safe. And so, without further ado, I welcome and express my personal appreciation and admiration for former FBI Director Bob Mueller.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, John, and thank everyone for being here. There's one topic that was not on the agenda today that I thought I would spend a few moments talking about, and that's the intersection of law enforcement and intelligence. Before I do that, though, I want to a little story about introductions. That was a wonderful introduction, John. I have not gotten through all my introductions as well as you did. I had occasion, because I know there are persons here who have worked in a number of administrations. Many of you work with Colin Powell. So on one occasion, I had Colin Powell over to talk to our special agents in charge who were having a meeting here in Washington over at the Marriott across the bridge. And he's coming to get me as the lunchtime speaker, and he comes in the rear and somebody sees him and everybody gets up and claps wildly, gives him a standing ovation, as well they should. He walks to the front, I'm standing to the right. I come to the podium. When he gets up here, he gets another standing ovation. And so I start the introduction by saying, ladies and gentlemen, Colin Powell. He needs no further introduction, but he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. So Colin comes up to the podium, stands for a second, and says, well, Bob, just because I do not need an introduction does not mean I do not want an introduction. I sort of crawled to the side. What I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about my education in the intelligence arena. I started a week before September 11th as the director of the FBI, and I had spent all my career as a prosecutor prior to that as a lawyer. And I looked at things in the box that lawyers look to. And I anticipated that I would be dealing with narcotics cases, bank robberies, white-collar crime, a staple of federal law enforcement when I took over the Bureau. And that was not to be. On September 11th, when the first plane struck, an agent came in and said his plane had gone into a building in New York, bright and clear here, bright and clear in New York. Second plane goes in. By the time the plane went into the Pentagon, we pretty much understood that it was a terrorist attack, and quite probably bin Laden, and ended up being down in our operations center on the 5th floor, where we had the occasion to have an FAA announcer intoning on an input into our room the fact that there was a hijacked plane that was, as he said, hijacked plane 90 miles out inbound Washington, D.C. A few seconds later, hijacked plane inbound Washington, D.C., 80 miles out. And you sit there, the one thing I remember about that day is you sit there and you wonder where that plane was going to hit. You didn't know whether it was going to hit the Capitol or the White House, or perhaps a location where your family may be, or even the FBI. Obviously, that was a plane that went down in Pennsylvania, but that is my most vivid memory of what happened on that day. My education in terms of how one responds to that kind of attack really was initiated 2 or 3 days later when I had to give my first briefing to President Bush. I'd met him once before and being interviewed for the job. This was the second time, and I go in, I think fully prepared, and it's President Bush, and it's Vice President Cheney, George Tenet, chuckling on the side, I might add. But I'm in there with President Bush, and I start out by saying that, Mr. President, the FBI has established command centers at each of the sites, and we're starting to identify the individuals by their seat numbers on the planes and the like. And my memory of it is I get about 2 or 3 sentences in, and the president says, well, Bob, that's all well and good. That's exactly what I expect the FBI to be doing. It's what you've done fairly well over the history of that institution's existence. My question to you today is, what is the FBI doing to prevent the next terrorist attack? What is the FBI doing to prevent the next terrorist attack? And that was the question that was asked on that day that I did not have an answer to. I felt like that high school student who got the wrong assignment. You show up, you're all prepared, you're ready, but unprepared, unready to answer the one question that was most meaningful in the White House on that day. Continued to brief the president just about every day during his first term, at least once a week second term. President Obama, once a week first term, now probably just about every other week. And over that period of time, that question has not changed. And for us in the Bureau, it was a shock. It was a shock to me. I did not think in those terms. I thought, as most agents think, about gathering evidence, getting in a courtroom, prosecuting somebody and putting them away, and feeling a degree of satisfaction for doing it, and then moving on to the next case. But out of that question came several initiatives. The first was prioritization. Understanding that while we have a widespread jurisdiction, we had to prioritize counterterrorism, we had to prioritize counterintelligence, and we had to prioritize cyber, and we did. Moved 2,000 agents from the criminal side over to national security, and assured that every special agent in charge, all 56 of them, understood that they had to address them in order. They had to assure that there's no Muhammad Atta swimming in their division, and that was their first responsibility. And then you go down. There were 5 criminal priorities. They were transnational, international organized crime, public corruption, civil rights, because if we do not do it, it does not get done, white-collar crime, and violent crime. Everybody in the organization knew that those were our priorities. The second great change for us is to understand that no longer are we looking at pieces of information as evidence, but we're looking at pieces of information as part of a mosaic that may be able or may enable us to answer that question as to where the next attack is coming from. And it was not easy, and I, for one, did not really understand how to build an intelligence capacity, and there were a number of missteps that I made. But ultimately, I recognized that For us, it's changing the metrics, how we evaluate ourselves, and understand that we should focus on the threat, focus on what we know about that threat, and more importantly, focus on what we do not know about that threat, and go and collect against those gaps. No longer could our metric be the number of arrests, number of indictments, number of convictions, about how well we were doing in developing sources or putting up wires and answering that one question of what are you doing to prevent the next terrorist attack. I understood there were differing skills that you need: domain manager, requirements manager, skills and capabilities that were different from the collection of information that the Bureau has traditionally done. Now, the one point that cannot be forgotten in my mind is the skill sets that we have in the Bureau as collectors are as good as any place in law enforcement in the world, and pretty darn good. Interviews, interrogation and the like, HUMIT, wires, whether it be under national security or Title III, forensics, whether it be the fingerprints or DNA, or currently cyber forensics, and last, surveillance. All of those capabilities that were used in the past to get evidence into a courtroom could now be used to paint a picture of the threat, understand what we know and understand what we do not know. And we've made some progress. We've made some progress there. There are two areas that, additionally, that were tremendously important. The first was the understanding that for us to be successful, we had to develop relationships with the CIA. George sent over, at that point, several dozen analysts to help us out. George and I became fast friends, and I've been fast friends with just about every CIA director that served in the interim that I was at the Bureau. The statutory, knocking down the walls was tremendously important. But the other aspect that I think is overlooked, and that is the capability of the criminal justice system in the United States to contribute to the intelligence collection. We have, in just about every case that we had successfully taken down over the last number of years, one of the great components has been the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. Those task forces with state, local, federal, other agencies on it. But also because in just about every case where there are two or more persons, one of those will cooperate and give us intelligence. If you go to the UK, and one of my complaints in the UK is they will arrest, particularly in the wake of the July attack in 2005, persons, lock them up, but there is no incentive for that person to cooperate. And the fact of the matter, that person has as good intelligence as anybody else because that person has been trained overseas, been talked to overseas, been radicalized, and has the information that we need. And so over a period of time, building those relationships with the other agencies, but also understanding that it goes beyond the arrest, indictment, and conviction. It goes into utilizing that capability as an adjunct to developing intelligence to prevent the next terrorist attack. Let me speak just for a second, and then I'll open it up to questions you may have about partnerships in another arena, and that is cyber. There's a very little doubt in my mind that we're going to have a relatively substantial cyber attacks down the road, whether it be on the financial sector or the grids or what have you. Do I think we are prepared for them at this juncture? I do not think so. I think we're moving in the right direction, but there are a number of areas that continue to need work. The first is lanes in the road. Three major players, NSA, FBI, DHS, whatever order you want. Over the last couple of years, Keith Alexander, Janet Napolitano, myself, worked to straighten out and identify the lanes in the road so that we weren't, no sharp elbows, because there is some overlap in the legislation, and I think we have been relatively successful in doing that. The other aspect of this arena, the cyber arena, that often is overlooked is the necessity for focusing on the warm bodies behind the computers. We tend to think of cyber and cyber investigations as investigations employing, as I will talk to Keith Alexander about, X number of geeks to do the investigation, when in fact, it's not that different than anything else, just new and different implementation. You need to identify that person behind the keyboard, and you need to do it using wires. You need to do it utilizing HUMINT. You need to do it in addition to with physical surveillance, in addition to the forensics that are tremendously important. And it is not altogether bad in my mind that we are identifying and have identified, whether in the private sector or the public sector, those persons who are sitting behind the keyboards in places like China. And once identified, we ought to do our level best to wrap those persons up. I know it's difficult, but there has to be a penalty and there has to be deterrence in this arena, as there is in just about every arena where you're crossing the line into illegal activity. And lastly, in this area, what is absolutely essential is harnessing the capabilities of the private sector. If you look at counterterrorism, our essential partner there was state and local law enforcement, because through state and local law enforcement, you gathered the intelligence to give you the broader picture in any community. Because of the expertise, the knowledge, the capabilities of ISPs and the private sector, we are not going to be successful in addressing this unless we find a mechanism whereby intelligence and information can flow to the federal side, NSA, FBI, DHS, in some open mechanism that the American public is aware of. They don't need to know the details. They don't know the information that is being passed, but there has to be a structure that enables the American people to see and agree to that structure, number one, and number two, that gives the private sector a safe harbor from suit when they provide that information. At bottom, it's partnerships. At bottom, it is coming together on days like today and renewing acquaintances and relationships and the like. At bottom, it is our working with Congress, the administration working with the private sector to break down the walls as we broke down the walls in the wake of September 11th. And as part of the intelligence community, the FBI needs to be a major player, given the capabilities and resources, access to the communities here in the United States. I'll finish with people ask me about changing the culture. They say changing the culture of the FBI, and I always resist that, because the culture of the FBI is one that should not change. Hardworking, dedicated, patriotic agents. And people talk about transformation of the Bureau, and I reject that. I say augmentation, added capabilities in the intelligence sector. And the question it was raised in my mind, but is raised in others, well, you didn't join the FBI to do this kind of work. You joined the FBI to put people in jail. I became a prosecutor because I liked putting people in jail and going through the trials. But the fact of the matter is, for the FBI, you have to be adept and agile in addressing that next threat. And while you keep your culture, while you keep your values, you have to develop new organizational structures to address the new threat and move on. But that does not necessarily mean that everybody is going to be happy. I had, about a month before my term was over, I was up in New York and had occasion to visit an agent again who I'd first visited in the wake of September 11th. In the wake of September 11th, I'd moved the core of the Al-Qaeda case from New York to Washington, D.C. on the belief that it had to be addressed at the national level. I could not rely solely on one office to direct the investigation. Well, not everybody was happy about that, including an agent by the name of George Pellegrino. George was a crusty agent, been around forever and a day. He was the lead expert on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, super agent, just the kind of person you want. And when I moved the case from New York to Washington, he was not a happy camper, and he tended to let me know. And so periodically I'd go visit the office in New York, and periodically I'd see George. Well, a month before I was leaving, I was up there seeing George, or I was up there visiting the office and wandering around, and I saw George. And so I went up to George, said, "George, how you doing?" He said, "Fine, Director, how you doing?" I said, "Fine. Looking forward to getting retiring?" I said, "Not really." I said, "Well, George," just sort of came upon it, "George, what is the biggest beef that you have with the Bureau today?" He paused for a second, asked a question, "Well, sir, when are you leaving?" I said, "In about a month." He said, "My biggest beef is going to be resolved in just about a month." I say that because, not everybody is happy all the time, but he is testimony to what the Bureau is capable of, the great things about the Bureau, but also the vignette is somewhat instructive about it's not what we want to do, what we like doing, but what the American public expects us to do, which is as important as anything else. Now, I'd be happy to open it up to questions. I will tell you that when I go out to the offices and at the outset I say I'll give a few remarks and afterwards I'll take questions. And when I get through the remarks and I say are there any questions, there is usually dead silence, and I didn't realize why that was until somebody whispered in my ear. He said, well, Director, everybody in the Bureau signs a piece of paper saying that they would be willing to go any place in the world that the Director of the FBI wants to send them. So they're all sitting there saying, do I want to ask a question that displeases the Director and I'll end up in Yemen or someplace like that? I have no control over anybody here, so I'd be happy to try and answer any questions.
I'm Ray McGovern from Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. A question about parallel construction. For 10 months now, we've known that the FBI and the DEA have used information originally acquired from NSA, but information that would not stand up in court, and they have parallelly constructed cases enabled by the NSA information to make it appear that your excellent detective work has worked. Now, how do you feel about that? Do you have any legal qualms about parallel construction?
Where it is, I would, as you call it, parallel, what is construction? Is that the word you use? That's not a word that I'm familiar with or use. Often there are differing ways that you obtain information that may be consistent, may be inconsistent. Some may be classified at a different level than others. And so long as I am satisfied that is within the law and judges have upheld that capability, then I'm okay with it.
Well, the question is whether it's legally acquired. And if it's legally acquired, you could use it in court. Why do you have to go back and make believe you learned about it in a different way?
Well, let me put it a couple of ways. You can legally acquire certain information, as we do under the FISA statute, for instance, but that does not mean it can be used for other purposes without perhaps other judges' approval.
Right.
And so while you say legally acquired, that is the first step that I'm concerned about, but also it has to be used legally as well. Some of it may not be admissible for a variety of reasons, but that does not prevent us from acquiring it. People often come up, and not often, but will say, well, why don't you merge the CIA and the FBI? Wouldn't it be easier? Wouldn't it be more successful? To which my response is, we collect under different authorities. What the authorities for the CIA, NSA, and others collecting overseas are completely different, not completely, but different than the authorities under which the FBI collects in the United States, and appropriately so. So I am comfortable with the authorities on either side, CIA, NSA on the one hand, and law enforcement, domestic intelligence on the other hand. And then it's up to the rules of court as to that which is admissible. Surely.
Hello, my name is Samantha Bertel. I'm a master's candidate here at Georgetown School of Continuing Studies. And I had a question regarding the definition of terrorism. Each intelligence community agency has a differing definition of terrorism. Wouldn't it behoove the community, in order to foster a better sense of understanding what we're going after, to have a single definition rather than multiple definitions of terrorism?
Well, the statutory definition that we use to define the activity that was considered illegal. There are other definitions around. I'm not certain it makes a tremendous amount of difference. It becomes a political issue at a geopolitical level, generally does not affect us on the ground when we're doing an investigation. We will have those persons together that have the appropriate authorities, whether it be state and local or federal authorities or or even the intelligence community in order to address a particular incident of terrorism. You take Fort Hood, Major Hassan. There are issues about how you designate that, but from the purposes of the investigation and making certain that all the facts are run to ground, the definition itself is secondary.
So for a secondary definition, does that mean that we are now establishing that there are multiple types of terrorism?
Well, the multiple types of terrorism, yes. Many types of terrorism can fit in most definitions of terrorism. The one I'm most familiar with is the one in Title 18.
Okay. And then how do we handle that legally if we have so many different versions of it?
Well, it's like just about every large case, you're going to have a number of players that are addressing that particular case from the investigative or prosecutorial point of view. They will have different statutes under which they operate. The state prosecutor has the state statutes, the federal prosecutor has the federal. And every one of the cases, you sort it out and you reach agreements, or you don't reach agreements and you go ahead and indict. But that's, one of the things we have, 18,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in the United States. And consequently, it's very hard to get unanimity on anything. And it's very easy to get different views on just about anything. But we, as a federal system, we work pretty well.
Okay, thank you.
That's it. Well, let me thank you, everybody, for being here today. And many of you I've dealt with over the years when I was at the Bureau. And I want to thank you in particular for your support of the FBI, our mission, and most particularly, I thank you for all you do to keep this country safe. Thank you.